Well, we're back and we're ready to start again. At the end of the last lecture, I was talking about this term mercantilism. And mercantilism, as I've tried to explain, I may not have made it clear yet, but mercantilism was the dominant economic theory of the time. All people in Western Europe agreed that the proper way to run a country was to use the principles of mercantilism. Now, different countries did it differently, and we're only interested in the English. I might just say the English probably did it better than anybody, well, maybe with the exception of the Dutch. The Dutch were also very successful. They were much better than the Spanish. And the Spanish, as we've talked about, had a lot of gold. There was a time when Spain was by far the richest country in Europe. After the conquest of the Aztecs in 1520, Spain just had this huge amount of gold that they stole from the Indians and brought to Spain and became the richest country, and everybody was jealous of them. That's why Henry VII wanted his son to marry the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. Spain was this great, very rich country. Because they got all the gold and they did it the easy way, they stole it. England wasn't able to do that. But England instead emphasized the idea of trade. And the basic principle, which the English did better than the Spanish, and eventually England became much wealthier than Spain. Spain went downhill because they didn't get it, and the English did. And the trick is, as I was saying last time, export more than you import. And so the idea is to work policies and have the government take an active role in developing policies to encourage exports and to discourage imports. And I might just mention that that sort of underlies the kind of the economic philosophy of President Trump, who is a mercantilist. This is not free trade. This is not free capitalism. This is an idea of a government that plays an active role controlling markets, controlling what goes on in the economy in order to supposedly promote great wealth. So the English developed various ways to improve their exports and reduce their imports. And the idea of colonies fit into this very well, as I was saying, because there are some products that you don't want to import, but you have to. You need them for your economy, and you can't produce it domestically. You can impose tariffs to discourage imports, but that doesn't improve exports because you've got a natural resource or a climate or something that makes it impossible. The classic example of a product that everybody focused on and everybody was trying to get more of it was sugar. And everybody recognized that sugar was highly desirable. Everybody wanted sugar in their diet, and they wanted sugar to make food more edible and so forth. So there's this great desire for sugar, and no matter what you do, you can't grow it in Western Europe. The weather doesn't allow it. You don't have a long enough growing season. So everybody went to the tropics, mainly the Caribbean, or also known as the West Indies, or Brazil. The Portuguese went to Brazil. The Spanish, the French, the English, and the Dutch went to the Caribbean. But they all produce sugar, and the idea is to encourage sugar production and then being able to import the sugar back to your country without having to import it from somebody else. So sugar was a main object of England's mercantilist policies. And the emphasis of the English Empire was on the Caribbean, where they produced sugar. That was made the Caribbean the most important part of the British Empire. That was the part they cared about first. They established colonies in the Caribbean decades before they came to Virginia and then established colonies that we study. So that was what English mercantilism focused on. And the idea was to encourage the production of sugar within the British Empire at British colonies such as Jamaica and Bermuda and Barbados, some other small islands around the Caribbean. That was what was important. That's what mattered. And within that picture, the North American colonies were not as important. They didn't matter as much. For decades, the only product that the American colonies produced was tobacco. Well, okay, tobacco is a product that people could produce in America, and they could make money on it, and they could sell it at a profit and so forth. But frankly, it doesn't fit in with the policies of mercantilism. It's not a good example of something that you want with mercantilism. There's some other little things that were produced in the Caribbean, some very special items, some little kind of exotic plants that were spices, or there's a product called indigo, which they needed as a dye for the textile industry, for clothing, and some other very specialized crops, but all in the Caribbean. And here's North America, or at the time, the only colony that was engaged in commercial agriculture was Virginia, and they're growing tobacco, which doesn't fit. It doesn't work. For one thing, tobacco is not a necessity of life, like sugar, especially under the rule of King James I, who didn't like tobacco, who thought tobacco was a nasty product. So the king doesn't even like it. And it's certainly not a necessity. And you, in fact, can grow tobacco in England. It doesn't require a tropical climate. It can grow in a moderate climate, such as is in England. And there were people in England who were growing tobacco. Farmers were growing tobacco in England. So tobacco just doesn't work. So the English focus was, first of all, we're going to emphasize the Caribbean, we're going to emphasize sugar, we're going to emphasize some of these other little products, but that are very specialized and almost exotic little things. But they're nice, like some spices, and as I say, indigo. You don't need a lot of indigo, but it was something that the textile industry needed very badly in order to produce clothing that was not just the same color as a sheep. You could dye it with and make it colored, and from a marketing standpoint, that was very important to the textile industry. But a little indigo goes a long ways, and so it's not a big deal. So those are things but those are the things that England's policy focused on. What they decided to do about tobacco was just to focus on the profit of the trade itself. American farmers were producing tobacco. They were selling it to Dutch cigar makers. That's where the market was. And so what England decided was, let's have English merchants engage in that trade and let them make the profits. When the industry started, when people started growing tobacco in Virginia, and actually for several decades after that, most of the people who bought the tobacco from the Virginia farmers were Dutch merchants. There were Dutchmen who came to America in Dutch ships, purchased a cargo of tobacco from American farmers in Virginia, later in Maryland, and eventually into North Carolina. They would take it to the Netherlands, and sell it there to the cigar makers, and they would make a profit as the middlemen, as the merchants who were engaged in the trade. And that went on for a while, and during the 1630s and 40s and 50s, this trade was going on. It was getting bigger and bigger. It was getting to be more and more profitable. There were more and more people growing tobacco. This becomes a major activity of North America. But at that time, England was caught up in domestic affairs. That is a whole nother story. Sometimes when I have a little bit more time in other semesters, and I talk a little bit about English history in those years, because it's important for America. It's important for us to know what's going on in England, because we're English colonies, and so we're affected by events in England. And England was involved in civil war. There was some bitter fighting. There was about religion. It was about power. It was struggles between the king and parliament. It's a very complicated story. There was a time there when the king was executed. There was a time there when England didn't have a king. They tried to govern without a king for a period of 11 years. And they're all caught up in that. And so America was just sort of forgotten. I mean, and they just didn't have time or energy to deal with American issues because of their focus on what's going on in England. But in 1660, all of that came to an end. A complicated story. That the monarchy was restored. The peace came to England. The civil wars that had torn it apart for so long stopped. And so England finally could look at America, and Parliament, the English governing body, remember the legislature, if you will, of England, looked at America and said, we're going to implement some mercantilist laws. We're going to start imposing mercantilism on the Americans. This business of they're just trading with the Dutch and making money for Dutch merchants, that's got to end. The system is supposed to make money for English merchants. So, in 1660, England passed a law that actually has a very long, elaborate name. I just condense it down to the Act of Trade and Navigation, or even the Navigation Act, just if you really want to just get simple and just use a short phrase to describe what is actually a very long title of the law. And what this law did was to say that all trade of the colonies had to be in British ships. No more would Dutch merchants be allowed to come to the American colonies. It was against the law for Dutch merchants to come into any port or harbor anywhere in America and buy products, engage in trade, sell things. Remember, one of the first things they sold was some Africans. That all has to stop. Now it's only going to be a British ship, and the law defined a British ship as a ship whose owner was a British subject, the captain was a British subject, and 3/4 of the crew had to be British subjects. So they had some specific regulations about what ships could come into American ports and which could not. Only British ships could come in. That meant now that the Dutch merchants are excluded, and that's what England wanted to do. I mean, the Dutch were their biggest rivals. The Dutch were very successful merchants in their own right. They were big rivals of the British. The French and the Spanish and other countries were far behind. But the Dutch were a real challenge to England's merchants, and so this law is to benefit English merchants by excluding Dutch merchants. And then England followed that up 3 years later with a law known as the Act of Enumeration, and these will be put in writing for you as we do always at the beginning of each lecture, or at the beginning of each week. The Enumeration Act. Enumeration means to number, to identify, to list. And the Act of Enumeration identified certain products of the Americas that, if exported, had to go to England. And that included the obvious suspects: sugar and indigo and those spices and some of those other very specialized exotic crops, which they didn't grow very much of, but were things that were very desirable. And they had to be sold to England. And the only thing that affected North America, and as of 1660, the only thing that North Americans were producing for commercial purposes was tobacco. And what that meant now then was that even British ships could not carry tobacco to the Netherlands to sell it to Dutch cigar makers. It had to go to England. It's enumerated. The law is only enumerated goods can only go to England itself. So that meant that we could no longer sell the tobacco to Dutch merchants, I mean, Dutch cigar makers. We couldn't sell them to Dutch merchants from the original act, and now we can't even sell it to the Dutch cigar makers. But the Dutch cigar makers are still the customers for tobacco. Those are the people who used tobacco and made cigars, and that's how the tobacco got into the market. That's how it got consumed. It was manufactured into cigars, and the people who did that, the people who had those skills, and that's a very specialized craft, those people were all in the Netherlands. So the tobacco is still going to go to the Dutch in the Netherlands, who are going to make it into cigars. But what happens now is the tobacco has to go from a Virginia farm to England, where a merchant is going to buy it and then turn around and re-export it and sell it to a Dutch cigar maker and make a profit on the deal. Make a profit as a middleman. And that's what the English mercantilism system was all about. It was to make profits for English merchants as middlemen in this trade. At least that's how they're going to make money out of North America. They're still going to have the sugar being consumed in England. That you can consume in England and other products. But for the North American colonies, this now meant for the part of the British Empire that we study, they had to sell their tobacco to English merchants, who in turn would act as middlemen and sell it to the Dutch. Now you might think about what this means, that the middlemen are going to be making money. Where does that money come from? Well, the answer is, sort of, if you think about it, it's pretty obvious. Some of it is going to come from the consumer, which would be the Dutch merchant, and then the price of the tobacco, cigars. Some of it is going to come from the Dutch merchant, the consumer, and some of it is going to come from the producer, the American tobacco farmer. So what this is going to result in is lower prices paid for tobacco. The Virginia tobacco farmers, not able to sell their tobacco directly to the Dutch cigar makers, now have to sell it to an English merchant who's probably going to pay them less, because he's going to turn around and sell it to the Dutch cigar makers and charge them more, but he has to do that so that as a middleman he can make a profit. So they're going to make a lot of money at the expense both of the producers, the tobacco farmers, and the consumers, the Dutch cigar makers. But that's the way the English system worked. That's mercantilism. That's what it's about. That's the purpose of the system. And that's what England perfected with regard to tobacco and a range of other products, and the English economy is very complex and a lot of things that don't affect us here in North America. But overall, England was doing mercantilism very well, and England was becoming very wealthy. And be sure you understand the question, who in England is becoming wealthy? Well, it's the merchants. That's why the system is called mercantilism. The word mercantilism was actually invented in 1776 by another economist named Adam Smith, who was actually Scottish. And he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, and he described the system that was in existence and gave it a name. People had been doing it without having a word to describe it, but he described it as mercantilism because he recognized that it was focused on making profits for merchants. And he attacked the system. He criticized it. He said, in fact, it's not the most efficient way, it's not the best way to promote the wealth of the nation. That's the title of his book was, or the condensed title, the abbreviated title, is The Wealth of Nations. And he said, ironically, the best way for a country to promote its wealth is for the government to do nothing, for the government to get out, to have free trade, to have a free market. And he became the great advocate of capitalism, which attacked mercantilism as being less efficient. He said the system works better if the government leaves it alone. So you may also be familiar with the phrase laissez-faire to describe this kind of economic system. But that didn't come along until 1776. In the years that we're studying, we're back in the 1660s, mercantilism was still the accepted notion. Basically, everybody agreed with it, and that's what English policy was all about. Now, there's one other little feature of this system, one other specific feature that I want to mention, and that is that the colonies could buy products only from England. And the idea here is to have the colonies serve as markets for English manufacturers to promote English exports. The colonies are going to be a market, and the colonies were required to buy all of their manufactured goods from English manufacturers, brought to them by English merchants. That's the system. It's going to promote wealth, it's going to promote business for English businesses, English merchants, English manufacturers. And just as some things could not be produced in England, there are other products that England could not produce because of natural factors. An example that I use is wine. Wine is, as you know, made from grapes, and grapes don't grow in England. You can't manufacture wine in England because of the natural resources. You know, nature says no wine can be produced in England. Actually comes from several places in Europe: Italy, Spain, France, Germany. They all have wineries, but England couldn't, just because of its latitude, of its natural background. But so people in England who drank wine imported it from the wineries in Europe, and Americans, if they wanted wine, had to buy wine from English merchants. They couldn't buy it from the actual wineries. They couldn't buy it from the French or the Italians or whoever was manufacturing the wine. They had to get it from English merchants. Well, this is sort of the same concept, it's just in the opposite direction. English merchants bought wine from the wineries in Europe, and they paid whatever for it, and then they turned around and sold it to the Americans. All they do are middlemen. Sometimes the wine may not have even ever left a boat. It's like tobacco growing to the Netherlands. It never leaves the boat. The wine comes in from Europe, comes to an English merchant who turns around and takes it to America and sells it and makes a profit. But of course, by making that profit, that means that the consumers in America are going to be paying more for it. That was sort of what Adam Smith was saying. It would be more efficient, it would work better if you let the consumers in America go to Europe and buy the wine there. They could get it cheaper, they could get it easier, and everybody would benefit. The consumers would benefit because they get lower prices. We would get rid of the English middlemen who didn't do anything, and the only reason they could do anything was because the government said you had to go through English middlemen. they had to make a profit, and so Americans lose, both as tobacco farmers and as wine drinkers. So this is what the system worked. In fact, England had a very complex set of laws regulating trade. I've only touched the surface. I've only mentioned a few little aspects of it. Over the next, say, 100 years, from 1660, when they first started, down to, we'll say, 1760 rather, 100 years later. Over those 100 years, Parliament frequently tinkered with the laws. They amended them, they modified them, they added products to the enumerated list, they took products off the enumerated list. They had all kinds of other features of the laws that are very complex and take a long time to explain. And as the American economy developed as time goes by, America produced more and more goods. We started out only tobacco, and we have ended up with a wide range of agricultural products. We had a wide range of other products. We had timber, we had fish, we had iron, we're eventually going to get to furs, a wide range of things, not to mention agriculture, mostly focusing on grain, as I think I told you before, wheat, corn, some places rice, smaller things like rye and barley and whatever. But America, as it expanded, new colonies were established that had a much more diverse kinds of production. So there's all kinds of laws regulating that from Parliament. And very few years went by that Parliament didn't make some amendment or alteration or addition or whatever to this whole body of what we call the navigation laws, the navigation acts. And they're very complex. To enforce those laws, England established a royal body, a royal agency, and it's a little bit complicated because the name of it changed, but let me just, and they tinkered with that name, and so let me just give you a name that they used for many years, and then the other years they used different names, so it's complicated. We'll just call it the Board of Trade. England has set up a Board of Trade as a group of royal appointees. The Board of Trade, the members of the Board of Trade, were appointed by the king, and they are going to be the ones to sort of be responsible for administering and enforcing all of these trade laws in America. And they say the laws were fairly complicated. The way that the Board of Trade was supposed to do that was by appointing royal governors for each of the colonies. I don't know if I want to get into this. There are two colonies that didn't fit in, and it's complicated. I'll mention the two of them. I'm hesitant. I'm sitting here trying to decide at the last minute if I should get into this because it gets so complicated and so many details, and I'm not sure how many of these are important. But there were two colonies that were both established by people who were sort of kicked out of Massachusetts Bay. Either they kicked out or they left or whatever. And one we've talked about, that was Rhode Island, established by Roger Williams. And the other was Connecticut, which was established by a bunch of people who didn't get along with some of the other officials in Massachusetts, so they left and founded their own. And eventually, both of those colonies got charters from the king. They were chartered colonies then, but the charters were sort of after the fact. They were not ever intended to be for a business. They were legal documents setting up a local government for the colony of Rhode Island and the colony of Connecticut. And they allowed the people to elect governors. So there were two colonies in which the people appointed the governors. So the people elected the governors along with their assembly, along with their legislative body. But those are there are only two of them, and they're both fairly small. So we can generalize, and that's why sometimes I don't bother to get into Connecticut and Rhode Island, but we could generalize and say that American colonies, the other 11 colonies, all had royal governors appointed by the Board of Trade. And the Board of Trade would give them what were called their instructions. The governors were almost always people from England. Occasionally, maybe some local American would be appointed as a governor, but rarely. Most of the governors were people from England. The normal term was a 3-month period as a governor. The governors would be appointed to serve for 3 years, and they would then be given their instructions and the rules that they are to follow, and that's the way that England would establish its rules for the colonies. All of the rules were made by the Board of Trade and then transmitted to America by the governors. So the governors would come over with all of their rules, with all of their directions of the ways that they're going to run the colony during their 3-year term. And when that 3 years were up, they would go back to England, they would appear before the board, and they would give some kind of a report on what they had done. This is a way that England's going to kind of supervise the whole system, make sure it's working the way it's supposed to, keep control over the system, keep control over the colonies through the Board of Trade, and it's appointing governors. And so the governors would make a report explaining what they had done, explaining all of the ways that they had followed their directions, followed the instructions, followed the rules, and how it had worked, and if they'd had any problems and what the problems were, if they had any recommendations for things that should be changed or whatever. They'd make a report and they would be interviewed, as it were, or I don't know, somewhat set down by the Board of Trade, and that's the way it would work. The governors had almost unlimited power. Now there were assemblies, and I talked about that before. The people in all of the colonies elected an assembly. And remember, just to remind you, I hope I don't need to remind you, I hope you know this, because I don't want to have to keep reminding you, bring it up every time. But when I say the people, I mean white male landowners. As we know, England's system revolved around ownership of land, and that's the key to the whole English empire, is ownership of land by small farmers, by the actual settlers, not like the Spanish where they have these big haciendas and big hacienda owners and the Indians are all just out there as labor working for the hacienda owners. No, America has land owned by the farmer themselves. It's the family farm. And those farmers, the white males, could elect representatives to serve as the assembly for that colony. And so, yeah, they got to, the people elected an assembly. And I think I gave you a number before that about 75%, that's an estimate that I use. 75% of the white males were landowners. There were white males who were just laborers on the farms. Many of them were ex-indentured servants who just never became landowners. There are people who live in cities who don't own land, urban workers and so forth. Not very many, but maybe 10% of the population lived in cities. So there's other people who are not landowners, but the bulk of America, the mainstream, are the small farmers who were able to elect their members in their assembly. So the colonies all had an assembly. But in addition to the assembly, there's another house of the legislature. The colonies all had 2 house legislatures. Following England, which had the House of Commons and the House of Lords as Parliament, the counterparts to that were the assemblies in America and the other house, which, just for want of a better word, and terminology here becomes a problem because colonies use different terms and it's very hard to keep track of all these terms. So I just kind of simplify it, and I'm kind of, just skimming over some of the detail, but I call them the council. Well, so there's a 2-house legislature. The assembly is sort of analogous to the House of Commons because they're both elected by the people. The difference being that in England, the people were 5% of the males. In America, they're 75%. And then the other house in England is the House of Lords, which is hereditary. In America, it's the council, which is not hereditary, but it's usually appointed by the governor. So the governor has sort of hand-picked house of the legislature to kind of offset the assembly. So that's why the governor had, kind of some power in the legislature, because he appoints the council. He also appointed all royal officials. Now, there aren't many of them, but in every colony, of course, you had judges. Judges were very important because the courts are a very important part of American life, as they are of English life. A main function of the courts was to administer and decide property disputes. Land is very important, so there's a lot of conflicts over land ownership. A main function of the courts was to sort those out, so the courts played a very important part, so the judges were an important part of the colonies. And all the judges are appointed by the governor. If there are any other royal officials, somebody to act as a supervisor of the port, to administer the port, to act as a measure of weights and measures, a surveyor. There's a few officials of government in the colonies, and they're all appointed by the governor. Any act of the assembly could be vetoed by the governor. They all had the power to veto an act of the assembly, and the veto could not be overridden. There is no such thing as overriding a veto. So the governors had that absolute power. The assembly could meet only when the governor called it into session. Now that's a formality, but it has to be done. And if the governor just declines to issue an official call for the assembly, hear ye, the assembly come together, if he didn't do that, they couldn't meet. And once they started meeting, if they started to do anything that the governor didn't like, he could just disperse them. There's a word that I don't want to get into because it's a legal technicality, but he could just dissolve the assembly and send everybody home. So the governor had complete control over the assembly, both through the council that he appoints, through all of his other appointees, and through his power to veto acts of the assembly. And then just as a final check, everything that the assembly passed, even if the governor approved it, went back to England and would be supervised by the Board of Trade, and the Board of Trade could, if they didn't like what a governor had done, even if he had signed something, but they didn't approve of it, or they didn't think that it was in keeping with the laws, with all of these trade laws and so forth, they could disallow it, they could set it aside. So that's the way that England kept close control over its colonies. It's through the Board of Trade, which is appointed by the king and ultimately responsible to the king. So basically the king, through the Board of Trade, runs the colonies, and he has complete control over the colonies, and they are just totally under his thumb. I've been explaining all this to you, and I have to admit to you, I've been kind of having fun, because it's totally false. Everything that I've been telling you about the power of the king and everything like that, it's all just junk. It's all garbage. That's the way it worked on paper. That's the way it was set up. Those were the laws. That's the way it was supposed to work. The way it actually worked was totally different. Not that way at all. So I hope you've all been writing it down and putting it in your notes. King had, through the Board of Trade, had complete control over the colonies, and now I can tell you, now, zero, false. So I have fun sometimes doing this. I get a kick out of it because it's so silly. There are all kinds of reasons why this didn't work. For one thing, the Board of Trade was a very inefficient organization. It didn't have any established policies or rules. I mean, I compare it sometimes to the Spanish equivalent. It was sort of based on the Spanish counterpart. The Spanish had what they called the Council of the Indies, that was appointed by the king and ran the Spanish Empire. And the Council of the Indies of Spain had the laws of the Indies, as they were called. It was like a 4-volume set of rules and regulations for running the colonies and how they're going to do this and they're doing it, and all the policies in detail and specific things. And the Council of Indies obeyed and followed the laws of the Indies to the T, and some of those are very, very minor. Just every little detail of life in America was controlled by the Council of the Indies. Well, England never had that. The Board of Trade never had a book of regulations. They never had like a policy manual for their rules and regulations. And frankly, they didn't know what they were doing. From year to year, they wouldn't be consistent. The board didn't meet regularly. There were people on the board who didn't know what they were doing. Nobody went to meetings. They'd appoint a governor and then they'd forget about it. They'd send him some regulations and then they wouldn't know what they were. The board was not a very effective board at all. It was very dysfunctional. A lot of the guys who were on the board were only there because it was sort of a nice royal appointment, and they were going to try to see if they could figure out some way that they could make some money out of it. But they didn't care about what they did as on the board. They're just looking for some way to work a system and find some gimmick that they can use to make a private profit. And then a lot of times they wouldn't meet with the governors. They're supposed to meet the governor and have sort of a decommissioning of him and interrogate him and let him and find out what went on. They wouldn't do that. They didn't know. They didn't care. And if they did, they couldn't remember what he was supposed to have done, and they didn't keep records. And they didn't meet regularly, and when they met, they didn't always know what they were going to do. And from over time, they were totally inconsistent. They kept changing their minds, and so it's a totally ineffective system. Didn't work at all, and yet they're supposed to be running the empire. And yeah, the governor had all these appointees, and he could veto laws. But there's an important aspect of the way this ran that we have to bring in here. And it gets us down to a key issue. A lot of the times, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of times, events in history revolve around, and this is not a surprise, they revolve around the subject of money. Who controls the money? And a lot of time, if you want to understand history, if you want to understand current events, ask yourself the question, follow the money. Follow the money. Where does it come from? Who controls it? How do you get it? What can you do with it? Much of what goes on all depends on money. And in the American colonies, the assemblies controlled the money. Only the assembly could tax. The assemblies are sort of analogous to the House of Commons in England, which as of 1689, after the Glorious Revolution, only Parliament, and specifically, well, the House of Commons for common people, the House of Lords for the Lords, but there's only like 600 of them in the whole country. The House of Commons controlled taxes, controlled the money, and that's why, as when we were talking about England's experience with the Glorious Revolution and so forth, England is under what historians call parliamentary supremacy. Yeah, the king still had a lot of power. The king could do all kinds of things. But bottom line is, Parliament controlled the money. And the analogous thing in America, the assemblies controlled the money. So if a governor wanted to do anything that involved money, a lot of things that you want to do involve money. You have to if you want to build something, you have to get some money. If you want to hire people, you have to pay salaries, you have to get money. It all comes down to money. And so governors had to go to the assemblies to get money. If they wanted to do anything, they had to go to the assembly and get their approval to spend the money, to impose a tax or spend the money or do whatever. Even as mundane a thing as the governor's salary was controlled by the assembly. The assemblies decided how much the governor would make, and they appropriated the money for him, and if they didn't want to, the governor doesn't get any money. The governor is sure he can do anything he wants. He's got a lot of power. He can veto any act of the assembly. He appoints all these officials, and he can discharge the assembly if he wants. But if he wants his salary, he's got to get along with the assembly. And most governors figured that out. Most governors were smart enough. They aren't the smartest guys. Frankly, a lot of them are kind of dummies, and frankly, being a royal governor of a colony in America was not the most desirable job in England, and it was not something that necessarily attracted the brightest and the best of the English sort of ruling class. But the governors would come over, and they figured out if they want to get a regular salary, they'd better go along with the assembly. So yeah, the governors appoint all of the royal officials. They appoint all of these judges and sheriffs and whatever. Most governors would just say, "Tell me who to appoint. I'll appoint. You tell me. I have to sign it. I'm the one who signs it. I'm the one who is the official. It's my name on the appointment. But you just tell me what to do, and I'll do it." And most governors just got along. Every so often they didn't. Every so often there'd be a governor who'd get it into his head that he's going to be the ruler, he's going to be the governor, he's going to run this colony the way the law says he can. So he'd pull out his powers and do this and do that, and he had to find out some way to make up for the salary that he's not getting. Some of them came from wealthy families in England, and they could count on family money, but if they want to get their salary from the assembly and have the money here in America, they've got to get along with the assembly. I had a friend who wrote a biography of one of the governors, of Massachusetts, Governor Shirley, late in the colonial period, who didn't get along with the assembly, and he was going to try to be Mr. Hotshot and use some of the power that's his. He's the governor, he can do what he wants, and so he's trying to do it. And what my friend found in going through his papers and so forth was found letters that he would write to family in England and say, "I need money to feed my kids." I mean, he probably exaggerated a little bit, but he said, "My kids are going hungry because I can't feed them because the assembly won't pay me." And he was too dumb to figure out, get along with the assembly, Governor Shirley. But that's the way things worked. Now, this would have been easy to fix. England could have paid the governors out of the royal treasury. I mean, Spain did. Spain paid all of their royal officials in America, and that's why Spain, the Council of the Indies and authorities within Spain ran the Spanish Empire. Because, among other things, they paid for all of the Spanish bureaucracy, and the Spanish bureaucracy in America was very large, very elaborate. There were a lot of people, and they were all on the royal payroll. So they all depended on the royal government in Spain to pay them and to tell them what to do. Well, England could have done that, but maybe I haven't made this point clear. I've sort of been around it. Part of the way that England is running their American colonies is that they don't want to spend any money on it. They've never, from day one, wanted to spend money on the American colonies. That's just not the way the British Empire worked. They gave land to companies like you know, the Virginia Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company. They gave land to wealthy individuals, George Calvert, William Penn, or a few we've talked about. There have been others that we haven't talked about. They gave them land, the government would give them land, which then raised the question, who said it was theirs to give, but that's another question and we don't need to get into it. They just did it. They gave them land and said, now you run it. Don't bother us. You go over and take care of everything. And don't come to the Royal Treasury for money, because you're not going to get any. We're not going to give any money to you. We're not going to spend any money. It's not like the Spanish, who the Royal Treasury paid for all of the officials, it paid for all of the pastors, it paid for all the priests and the missionaries, paid for the army, it paid for everything. And so the Spanish had to get a lot of money from the Americans. They had to have taxes on the Indians and the other people in the colonies to pay for all the expense of running the Spanish Empire. Well, England doesn't have any expense for running the empire. They don't spend any money. That's the way it works. And they just never were interested in it. They never wanted to get into a situation where the Royal Treasury somehow had to pay for Americans. Let the Virginia Company pay the money. Let the Virginia Company lose all that money on trying to set up this colony in Virginia. Don't come to us. Just don't bother us. You take care of it, and it's your responsibility. If it works, you can make a lot of money, but if it doesn't, it's your loss, and it's not a loss for us. That's always the way they run things. And that's the way it still was. They didn't want to spend any money on governors' salaries. They said, you guys have your assembly, you can tax, the assemblies have the power to tax the people, you get the money, you pay for the governors, you pay for the judges, you pay for the royal officials, if there are any. Among other things, you pay for the military. And they didn't have big militaries, but what every colony had was what we call a militia, which is sort of an armed force of ordinary farmers. It's kind of a volunteer local militia. Every colony had a militia, and the assemblies were responsible for paying for the militias. They didn't pay very much because they didn't ever have to do very much, but that's the way England ran its defense. We're not going to send over English soldiers to America paid for by the Royal Treasury. We're going to have assemblies paying militias. They're responsible for their own costs, they're responsible for their own administration, they're responsible for their own legal system, they're responsible for their defense. They can tax, let them do it, and let them pay, among other things, the governor's salaries. Don't come to us for the governor's salary, we don't have any money. So as part of this, England never taxed the Americans. Assemblies taxed Americans. Americans paid taxes to their assemblies, never to the royal treasury, to royal officials, to Parliament, anything. Parliament never taxed Americans. It's sort of a trade-off. We're not going to spend any money on you, and so we don't expect to get any money from you. You've got to pay for your own expenses, so you tax yourselves. So, yeah, Americans paid taxes, but they paid them to their assemblies, which they elected. It was theirs. They controlled it. So they controlled their own taxes through their assemblies and through their elections. Actually, taxes in America were markedly lower than in England itself. English people paid much higher taxes, at least especially the upper class. They paid most of the taxes. And England spent a lot of money on things that Americans didn't. England spent a lot of money on the Navy, just as a side here. Americans benefited from the Royal Navy, but we never paid anything for it. So all of the costs of running the Navy was the responsibility of English taxpayers. And frankly, England had a very large and inefficient bureaucracy of a lot of people who just had all these royal jobs where they did nothing but not get a nice salary and rip off the whole system. So the English government was very inefficient. All the cost of it was paid for by English taxpayers. Americans didn't pay that many things. We didn't have that big of a bureaucracy. As I said, our assemblies did very little. Government was very low-key. yeah, we had to pay for the militias, but the militia is a voluntary group, and never took a lot of money, and it's only people who were serving part-time. We have no full-time formal armies. We just have these militias, which are these sort of like community-based organizations. Frankly, for many of the members of the assembly, excuse me, the members of the militias, the whole purpose was as a sort of a social organization. There's a chance for guys to get together, buddies to get together, and do guys stuff, which you all know what I mean. I can't talk about it here. I'm not allowed to describe what guy stuff amounts to, but you know. And that's partly what the militias were. They're just a bunch of guys getting together and having a good time. They hardly ever had to do anything of a military nature. Every so often, the Indians would cause them problems, and so they go out and get after the Indians and make life miserable for the Indians. But other than that, they didn't have to do anything. So, in fact, what I'm saying is to re-emphasize what I told you earlier. America was largely self-governing. The key to understanding the British Empire in North America didn't work this way in the Caribbean, but that's another story. The key is that phrase, salutary neglect. England, for the most part, left America alone. They had their own governments, they had their assemblies. There were royal governors, but the royal governors were, mostly they just would go over and sort of go to parties and look nice and do nothing, because that's the way to get along. You just sort of go through the formalities and everybody loved you. So the question is, what caused this to change? Why didn't this last? So that's what we're going to start talking about in our next lecture.